Delighted today to welcome back another former student of the Al-Mahdi Institute who took a few modules with us. Dr. Glen Moran has a position at both University of Birmingham and is a lecturer at Newman as well. So without any further ado, I'll hand over to him to speak to us about British Muslim perception of biological evolution.
Okay, so first thing I'd like to just make a little disclaimer, given where we are, that I'm not making any theological or philosophical arguments in this. This is purely social science, and this is on the basis of what people have reported to me. So this is lay Muslim perceptions of evolution. If anybody wants to engage in any discussions of theology or philosophy, we can do that a little bit later. And I'll do my best to avoid answering probably what happens. So I start this what I'm doing today is basically what you're getting is kind of the abridged version of my PhD thesis. It's just kind of top level findings and stuff like that. Obviously it goes far more in depth. But I start my thesis with this quote. So it says most devout Muslims are creationists, so when you go to schools there are a large number of children of Islamic parents who trot out what they've been taught. So this is Professor Richard Dawkins. Most people familiar with Richard Dawkins? Yeah? So he said this in 2008. And there he is, the lovely Professor Richard Dawkins. Okay. So this quote pretty much sums up two major misconceptions people have when it comes to British Muslim perceptions of evolution, but I would say Muslim perceptions of evolution more broadly speaking. The first point is that most, if not all, Muslims reject evolution. And the second is that most children are indoctrinated with creationist ideas from a young age. I mean, if I go back to the quote quickly, I mean, people might say, well, he said here, most devout Muslims. But has anyone read much Dawkins' work, engaged with it? What he means by devout compared to just, he doesn't tend to distinguish, does he? He's just talking about Muslims. There is this monolithic group called the Muslims and they all believe X or Y. And we'll go into that in a moment. Now, most of Richard Dawkins' comments about the subject of evolution and Islamic creationism, and in fact the broader kind of media interest, which we'll touch on in a minute, of Islamic creationism, stem from an incident involving this book. So this is Harun Yahya's Atlas of Creation. Okay? This was published in 2006, but in 2007 it was translated into European and Western languages and distributed free of charge to colleges, schools, academic institutions, universities, and the like. And Harun Yahya is often said to be the pen name of somebody called Adnan Oktar. This is not strictly speaking true. The Harun Yahya movement has published over 300 books, and it's unlikely that they're all the work of Adnan Oktar. So I tend to refer to it as the, following Solberg, as the Harun Yahya enterprise, which is the notion that it is a larger movement. Others like Tanner Edis has instead suggested that Harun Yahya is essentially a brand and Adnan Oktar is the public face of it. So that was distributed free of charge, and that was taken as evidence that Harun Yahya is particularly influential and has a large audience, particularly in Europe. Following that, and post 2006, 2007, it was quite common to hear it claimed that there has been a rise in Islamic creationism. So there were several high-profile incidents that occurred and got media attention. So this is an article from The Times. It says here, Muslim medics boycott lectures on Darwin and evolution. So here, I mean, it's a bit of a bad screenshot I've done, but this is Steve Jones, who's a biologist at UCL. And he was reported as saying that Muslim medical students were walking out or refusing to attend lectures about evolution. And this was picked up by the media and really used to put forward that narrative that Muslims are anti-evolution. But Steve Jones later clarified his comments. What he said was, there's actually only a small number of Muslim students who were refusing to attend, and that the problem was not solely a Muslim problem. This was people of different backgrounds and different faiths. But his clarifications, as is often the case, weren't really reported in the same way the initial story broke. Here we have another incident here. So this is London imam subjected to death threats for supporting evolution. This is in The Guardian. It was again widely supported. So this was the case of Dr. Osama Hassan at the Masjid al-Tawheed in East London in Leighton. So it was reported that he voiced sort of pro-evolutionary positions and as a result of which he was issued with death threats. That was what was reported. The actual reality was slightly different. The death threats were very real. and should be taken very seriously. They were definitely real, but must be seen in light of a bigger context of events that were going on at the time. So Hassan had moved away from sort of Salafi activism in the 1990s, but also there was a power struggle going on in the mosque at that particular point. So kind of evolution was just used as the final point by which to attack him with. More to the point, with this particular case, I thought it was quite interesting because this was taken as being somehow reflexive of the broader Muslim community in Britain, but that particular mosque is affiliated with the Ahl al-Hadith tradition, which, you know, as we all know, is not a dominant trend in British Islam. So how far we can take that to be reflective of the wider community is potentially problematic. Another incident that got a lot of public attention was this UCL acts after creationist coup. So I think this was in 2008 again. Some Muslim students at UCL in London, they hired out the Charles Darwin room, of all things, it's quite ironic, to host a lecture by a member of the Harun Yahya movement. And again, this was taken as evidence for this kind of widespread rejection of evolution amongst Muslims, and also of the influence of Harun Yahya. But a colleague of mine, Salman Hamid, who's based in the States, actually interviewed the organizer of that event. And this is what Salman said about it. He said that the organizer's desire to invite Harun Yahya's group was less motivated by epistemological concerns, but had more to do with the idea of defending Islam. So this is the post-9/11 7/7 climate. This is also following the publication of The God Delusion, The Rise of New Atheism. So it was more about finding somebody that they thought could come and perhaps defend Islam from that perspective. And Salman then adds, during the interview, his interview with the organizer, I also asked her about her personal views on evolution. She accepts microbial evolution and animal evolution, but has trouble accepting human evolution, which we'll tackle some of those issues in a moment. But again, it's just that clear sign that not everything was as was reported. What we'll also learn is the fact that with this claimed rise in Islamic creationism is deeply problematic. Up until my PhD, there's very little empirical evidence or data to suggest what the levels of acceptance or rejection of evolution were. And we certainly don't have previous baselines to make a claim of a rise. Why am I not? My clicker's not working. So the aims of my study were just to do a general kind of overview and look at a broad range of topics to do with what British Muslim perceptions of evolution are, stances taken, influences on positions, what people's understandings were. So I tackled a broad range of subjects to look at the idea of is there really this kind of epistemic clash, as some people have claimed? And I was particularly interested in finding out what the contextual factors that shape people's views of evolution were. It was a qualitative study, 60 semi-structured interviews. My research was conducted in London, Birmingham, and Milton Keynes primarily. And I interviewed people of Pakistani, Syrian, Lebanese, and Iraqi backgrounds. Now, as you'd imagine, my methodology chapter goes into quite length why I chose those particular groups. I don't have time to go into that now, but I'm happy to answer any questions that people have on that particular point. So we look at the broader narrative about Muslim perceptions of evolution, but science more broadly speaking. They've not emerged in a vacuum. It's very much a kind of assumption of the Muslim monolith. There is this group, they are the Muslims, and they all believe X, they all believe Y. And this is clearly a product of the kind of post-September the 11th and 7/7 climates. And it's also influenced heavily by historical anti-Muslim and anti-Islamic sentiments. And it's very much a kind of rhetoric of the other. Muslims are othered within this dialogue, or as Richard Dawkins would say, alien. And Richard Dawkins really did say that because he said Muslim faith schools teach alien rubbish, which is quite an interesting way of viewing things. So I'm just going to give you a quote now. This is from my PhD supervisor, Professor Fern Elston-Baker. So she worked for the British Council for a while. She worked on a project called Darwin Now in 2009, which was to do with the Darwin anniversaries. She said, I was given the opportunity to spend time in a number of predominantly Muslim countries discussing evolutionary science, and increasingly I noticed a worrying trend towards Orientalist or clash of civilizations approaches towards Islamic creationism within Western scholarly public space and media discourse. This links in places into the wider monolithic representation of Muslims evident in the UK and beyond in the post-9/11, post-7/7 eras. Now, if we take this on board and look at this kind of way of viewing Muslims in general, that they are a monolith and predominantly are anti-rationalism, and kind of alien to our civilization. I mean, how would we imagine that those views would be extended to perceptions of evolution? I mean, pretty much you can assume that everybody rejects evolution, right? It's a natural extension of that. Because the idea is that Muslims have somehow like not experienced this kind of Western enlightenment. If you survey the academic literature, and my thesis, I think, had 3 chapters of lit review, so quite a lot, you'll find that 2 claims are oftenly asserted. The first is that, as I mentioned earlier, that Muslims in Europe and Britain particularly overwhelmingly reject evolution, and the second is that our friend who we mentioned earlier, Harun Yahya, is particularly influential. And I'll just give you a good, what I think is a good paragraph that explains that. So this is an article called Creationism in Europe, Facts, Gaps and Prospects, which kind of surveyed on a country-by-country basis the situation with creationism in Europe. And when discussing Harun Yahya, they made this comment. So they say, his Oktar, Harun Yahya's teachings are particularly attractive to Islamic youth living in the cities of Western Europe, many of whom indulge in a modern Western lifestyle, while condemning Western morals for being secular, materialistic and individualistic. To these young adults, Oktar's organization offers the perfect deal. And I think what you'll see here is this is a summary of the point I'm making, the way people make assumptions about Muslim views. In this, there is not a single citation or any evidence used to back up any of these claims, which I think is, I'm not sure, I don't know many areas of academia where you get away with this kind of claim without supporting it by any evidence. In fact, there's a huge body of evidence and literature that would argue against these kind of ideas. But it just seems to kind of, in many ways, it's like this fits the narrative that they're assuming, so they'll just put it out there and no one challenges them on it. So it kind of distorts the picture in many ways in terms of Muslim perceptions of evolution. What has happened is, in many ways, these kind of ideas have been recycled. So it'll appear in an article like that, other people will make reference to it, and there's this chain of evidence starts to get going that's basically not based on anything solid in the beginning. But eventually it ends up being taken as evidence. And if anybody's interested, I'm actually publishing a paper about this at the moment, which I go into this in quite a lot of length. Now, if you look at this way this is discussed, with the media, it's not really too much of a surprise that you get this is going on, and the fact these sensationalist stories are being picked up on. There's a significant body of research that shows that coverage of Muslims is overwhelmingly negative. And you would say that only really negative stories about creationism when it comes to Muslims are likely to sell or be appealing. But better should be, and I'm not afraid to call people out on this, better should be expected of academics, in my opinion. Quite why they've just gone along with this is a different story. And how does it pass the peer review process is another point that I'd like to make. So in order to understand this fully, we have a couple of things that are going on. So one of it is this kind of historical perceptions and views about Muslims. But secondly, we have something called the conflict thesis. So the conflict thesis is essentially the idea that science and religion are in necessary conflicts. I'm sure you're probably all familiar with heard that idea somewhere along the line. And the idea is that they have clashing epistemologies, different ways of seeing the world, and therefore are necessarily going to clash. And this has gained particular prominence in the works of the New Atheists. Anyone who's read The God Delusion will see this comes out quite a lot. You'll also find this in popular culture and discourse. And in fact, Evans and Evans report that the political rhetoric of contemporary scientists and their supporters also often portrays a situation of warfare. So it's not just clash, they're at war. But you can't really understand the conflict thesis without knowing its historical basis. The conflict thesis emerges from a specific context of 19th century West, particularly Britain and Victorian times. And it's to do with authority when it comes to issues of what we now consider to be science. I mean, the term science didn't really emerge until that period anyway, but it's an issue or a situation whereby the clergy were deeply involved in scientific endeavors. And then secular, what we now understand to be scientists, come along and they want to do research independent of the church and the clergy. How are they going to claim their source of authority? They have to do something to distinguish them and reclaim that authority from the clergy. And this leads into this emergence of the conflict thesis. Now, where Islam is concerned, I find that this is particularly interesting because we're all familiar with Animal Farm. It's going to be a random reference, yeah? But you know the whole all animals are equal, but some are more equal than others? When it comes to the conflict thesis, all religions are bad, but some and one in particular is worse than others, which tends to be Islam. It's seen as being more opposed to science. All religions are opposed to science, but Islam is particularly opposed to science. And one of the reasons is it's anti-rationalist. It opposes rationalism. And Muslims have always opposed this. It's actually kind of contradictory because the narrative comes out that Muslims have always opposed science, but then they all go and blame Ghazali for it anyway, which is a bit inconsistent. The Ghazali thing is really interesting. Even Dawkins picks up on this. Neil deGrasse Tyson has argued this as well. Anyone seen this? The whole idea that Ghazali comes along and ruins philosophy and science and everything else. I've read chapters and chapters in books of people arguing this, and they'll say these conservative voices came along in the Muslim communities and they ended science. Plural, right? These conservative voices, but we're only going to tell you Ghazali. Which to me shows the shallowness of some of the research. There are other voices that they could easily talk about. Very rarely are they mentioned. Plus, I mean, Ghazali's a bit more complicated than just saying he came along and said, no, let's stop this ruling against reason. But that's the way it's nicely and neatly packaged up. So going back to what I was saying earlier, you could take all of this into consideration. The Muslim monolith, religion and science are all in conflict. Islam is even more opposed to rationalism and is opposed to science. So this is the inevitable conclusion. All the Muslims are going to reject evolution. Now my clicker's not working, there we go. So we'll just quickly look at some of historical receptions and reasons that we might get different trends coming out in terms of early Muslim receptions of evolutionary theories. When I say this, I mean sort of post-Lamarck and Darwin, rather than trends that emerged before that. There is a narrative post-Darwin that most receptions that we can see that exist in the research that's been done are generally negative, but not unanimously. There is some diversity of opinion. But you cannot separate early responses to theories like Darwin's from the colonial context. This is a very, very important point. So if we look at the two figures that I've got pictures of here, so this is Sayyid Ahmed Khan, who I believe was the founder of Aligarh University in India. Now, Sayyid Ahmed Khan is writing at a time where the British are dominating the Indian landscape, and there's different intellectual responses. How do we deal with this? Not just from Muslims, but from all groups. When it comes to the Muslims, you have different trends emerge. So, for instance, the Deobandi movement is in part a response to this context. How do we deal with the challenges faced by British colonization? We return in many ways as much as we can to Islam. We wear certain things, we dress in a certain way, we act in certain ways. Sayyid Ahmed Khan's suggestion is, in many ways, we adopt many of the customs of the British. We dress like them, we talk like them, we act like them in so many ways. That's an oversimplification, but you can see the point I'm making. So when it came to something like evolution, I mean, there's another point actually I should mention. He said, no, we should actually take on board this. Maybe we can reinterpret religion to fit in an evolutionary worldview. And he tried to relate it back to previous Muslims who had talked about ideas that he saw as being related to modern evolution. So like Ibn Khaldun, Ibn al-Miskawi, the Ikhwan al-Safa, who supposedly talked about these issues. That's a very complicated issue. If anybody wants to talk about that later, we can. Because you have to understand as well, and this is something I didn't mention a minute ago, is science was used in the days of empire as a way of demonstrating Western Christian superiority over populations under colonial rule. Darwin himself wasn't a poor person from London working in the workhouses. He was a member of the elite society. His journey on the HMS Beagle was, what's the context? Why is the HMS Beagle sailing all across the world? It's part of the empire. So it's all heavily linked to this. So if you're living in that circumstance where science is being used to show that your occupiers are superior to you, and then they come along with an idea like evolution as promoted by Darwin, the political implications of this are quite significant, that might lead people to not just view a scientific theory on its merits. This is Mustafa Kemal, the founder of the modern Turkish Republic. And I think it's not hard to see why this might, like evolutionary ideas, might be promoted by the Turkish Republic when it was founded. It's very simple. In order to establish that state on a secular model, you're trying to wrestle authority in society away from religious conservatives, essentially. Again, oversimplification, but there's a broad idea. You can see where I'm coming from. So evolution was one of the means in which they attempted to do that. And I would argue that's one of the reasons why we're getting this backlash against evolution in modern Turkey. It's now been removed from the school curriculums, and you have movements like Harun Yahya emerging from that context. This clicker's not working every time I use it. There we go. Okay, there have been some studies that have been done previously. There's not many reliable data sets that we have available. This is one that I will talk about because I know it pretty well, and I'd say it's the most cited example. So this is data taken from Salman Hamid's Bracing for Islamic Creationism, which was in 2008. It was a response to the Harun Yahya Atlas of Creation controversy. And Salman was able to present data from Kazakhstan. You probably can't see this from too far back. Kazakhstan, Turkey, Indonesia, Pakistan, Malaysia, and Egypt. And basically, it was about acceptance of evolution. So the green could possibly not be true. The purple, I think it's purple, I'm colorblind, the black is probably false. Purple is never thought about it. And this kind of reddish color is probably true. So you can see it's nearly overwhelmingly on this side. It's green, it's anti-evolutionary. And this paper was published, Salman published it. He got his data from Riaz Hassan's study on being religious patterns of religious commitment in Muslim societies. And this paper is still cited regularly today. I've seen it seen conference presentations where they're still using this paper. The only problem is Salman Hamid has distanced himself from this greatly, because on reflection, he noticed there were some deep problems with it. The question about evolution, which you get all this data from, set it up like this. Do you believe in Darwin's theory of evolution or creation by God? And setting it up in that kind of dichotomy is deeply problematic. And we'll talk about that in a moment. Nonetheless, Salman has distanced himself from this paper, but it's still out there and still influencing much of the discussions. Okay. I'm going to do another shameless plug. This is from my boss at uni. So this is Amy Unsworth and David Voas's study. So this is my study is qualitative, based on 60 participants' interviews. Amy actually did a YouGov poll. She polled 6,020 people, including 815 Muslims. So we can take this as being much more representative. And I think my qualitative data can explain those trends. So if we bear in mind that rejection assumption I talked about before, all the Muslims reject evolution. What did Amy find from her poll of British Muslims? So black is strongly agree, grey is neither agree nor disagree, and white is disagree. So do you agree that plants and animals have developed over time from simpler forms? 42.4% of the Muslims agreed with it, 22% didn't know, and only 26.2% rejected this. So this is vastly different from this expectation that was out there. And also, if you look at, say, it's higher than the national average, but Pentecostals were more negative towards evolution than Muslims were, and including as well independent evangelicals. Now, that's with polling work, the very nature of polling work is you're going to get quite neat and tidy positions. Now, my qualitative work, that's quite text heavy, I'll just explain it. I initially set about trying to use traditional categorizations and positions of evolution. So it'll be accept, reject, human exclusionism, so you believe in an evolution of all things except in the case of humans. Micro but not macro evolution, which is the idea that you believe in evolution that's influenced by environment but doesn't lead to speciation, one species to another. And other categories, so didn't know and so on and so forth. But I found that this was deeply problematic because when you actually engage in conversations with people in everyday language, our positions are never that neat and tidy, are they? There's a lot of inconsistencies in what people report, especially about a topic like this that they don't generally understand that well. There's a lot of blurred boundaries between them. So I could talk to somebody and they might say, I absolutely reject evolution out of hand, and then you get into a discussion, why is that? And all they talk about is humans. I don't believe humans have evolved. So what about everything else? And they'll say, well, I don't believe that either. And you try and dig at why they don't believe that, and still they just return to humans. So is that a rejectionist position? Is that a human exclusionist position? You know, it's never that neat and tidy. So what I did in the end is I came up with this. So it's acceptance, partial acceptance, which includes a range of positions, outright rejection, others don't know. A colleague of mine, James Riley, is doing a similar PhD to do with Catholic perceptions of evolution, and he's just gone and said, look, all I can do is say broadly favourable and broadly unfavourable when it comes to evolution. But in this categorization that I used, so I have 15 of my 60 participants accepted evolution, 17 partially accepted, only 13 outright rejected, and 15 didn't know or weren't willing to commit to a particular position. So again, it's very mixed, but it doesn't follow this unanimous rejection that we're told should be found. Where should I be pointing this at? Oh, there we go. So I'll just give you some brief sort of quotes from participants about why they said they might take certain positions. So Lena was a female of Iraqi background. When asked about do you believe in evolution, she said, why not? All animals are related, yes. Why not? They have the same creator. If you or me as a designer, let's say, created something, I can develop it later on. That's quite an easy idea to get your head around. God creates and then he can develop later on. Summer was from a Syrian background, and she said, yeah, I do believe in Darwin's theory, but I still don't understand everything. I believe he's right on a certain level, but there are certain areas I don't know. And that actually reflects what a lot of people were saying. So a lot of people would be quite open in fact, I actually don't know much about this. I can see the sense, I can see the logic, but I don't have the personal knowledge base in order to really get into deep discussions about it. Interestingly enough, it was the people that were, well, in fact, this makes sense in many ways. The people that were really certain that they knew what they were talking about usually were negative about evolution. People that were sort of, I don't really know that much, tend to take a more favorable position. Where am I pointing? It's not. Here we go. So partial acceptance. So this is a big category that includes a whole range of different issues. So Rasha, a female Syrian background, she said when they explain the way you know, sometimes the way they explain, like, for example, why the giraffe has a long neck, and these kind of things, yeah, I do believe in that, but I don't believe that humans evolved from monkeys. So that's one particular position. Now the monkey issue is particularly important. We'll go back to that in a minute. The language of people's perceptions of what a monkey is compared to an ape is fascinating. Back to the same problem. Oh, there we go. Okay. Right. So Amy Unsworth's poll that I introduced a minute ago, remember it was predominantly the largest section were positive to do with evolution, and it was a small subsection that were anti. When you change the discussion from all from plants and animals, and you include humans in it, you say humans have developed over time from simpler non-human life forms, it jumps from being 44 or 42% favorable to 26.9. And the rejection sort of basically doubles to 44.2. In fact, you're switching it. So that shows that actually, for a lot of people, they don't have a problem with evolution per se, it's the issue of humans. That is a lot of people's objections. Now, quite often the assumption is that's to do with Adam and Eve, right? Adam and Hawa. Actually, that doesn't seem to be the case from my work. It's more people have an objection to the fact that we are related to monkeys because we're somehow special and more noble than that. And then you get this kind of idea, which is very, very classical creationist position. You'll find this from American creationist material. You see this kind of argument a lot. So Basim was a male of Pakistani background, said within a species, yes, I fully agree with. We've seen that in certain species that are land-bound, like on the Galapagos Islands. There are other species in other parts of the world that have adapted differently, but that is adaptation. And he means adaptation like this. So this is the typical micro and not macro evolution position. Changes occur, but it doesn't lead to speciation. It's interesting he mentions the Galapagos Islands because that does have an association with Darwin. So it does show there's a familiarity with some degrees of this. So my thing is it about Islam? Someone like Dawkins seems to be of the assumption that Muslims are all completely, everything they do is influenced by their religious belief. And again, I'll go back to this quote, most devout Muslims are creationists, so when you go to schools, there are a large number of children of Islamic parents who trot out what they've been taught. In fact, I'm just going to mention one thing about this. Dawkins spends his life, and Mohammed and I were talking about this earlier, Dawkins spends his life saying that religion is stupid, we should follow evidence. Do you know what his evidence for this line is? He visited one secondary school classroom that happened to have a lot of Muslim students. It's fascinating when you think of it like that. But is this true, this quote? Are Muslims, I mean, he says devout, so that's his get out of jail card, right? You can say, well, these are not all devout Muslims you've spoken to. But anyway, it doesn't appear to be the case. In fact, I would argue that most of my participants that were more favorable towards evolution were certainly probably more practicing than a lot of the people that were anti. And where do Muslims get information about evolutionary science from? Are they indoctrinated by their parents? So we'll look at that as well. Now, I was looking at contextual factors that might explain the differences of opinions I was getting, and this is something that I'm still playing with. One of my chapters goes into huge detail about identity complexity and stuff, which is too much to go into, I think, in a short discussion like this. But this is, broadly speaking, what I found. So we split it between more likely to accept evolution, that's evolution of all species, and also human exclusionist positions, which I would argue are closer to an acceptance and a rejection position. On this side, we have like sort of negative stances, which are more likely to accept microevolution but not speciation, and macroevolution, and outright rejections. What's more likely to influence in this? Well, if you're of Syrian, Lebanese, or Iraqi background, you're more likely to take a favorable position towards evolution than those of a Pakistani background. But why might that be the case? Well, because of migration history, it just so happens that they are new arrivals and more likely to have grown up in other countries and then moved to the UK, received their high school education there, and so on. They're also more likely to have a nuanced sense of their own personal identity. Whereas people that have been raised in this country, I mean, there's a massive body of literature that talks about this. If you're raised in this country as a Muslim, you're more likely to take a solid religious, socio-religious identity. And I think that that's playing a significant role in this. And I'll show you why. So British Muslims tend to develop a sort of self-identification that's based on the perception of a membership to a social group, which in this case is the Muslim social group. And it's often influenced by the values and emotional significance that people attach to it. Also, there's certain expectations and performances people feel that they have to do to be part of that group. And I think what's happening, and this is what I've argued in my thesis, and I'm just trying to get into more of this sort of stuff, is for a lot of people, and we'll see in a moment, they're not particularly invested in discussing evolution. It's not something that's really discussed that extensively in Muslim communities. I mean, put your hands up if you've really heard this extensively discussed. No? 2 hands at the back, so maybe we can discuss that in the questions. But generally speaking, it's not something people really talk about. And certainly not amongst families. When I was doing my interviews, I asked people, did you ever discuss this with your family? Did they ever tell you about it? No. Did you ever hear about this being discussed in a mosque or Islamic center? No. Did you ever discuss it in your social circles? No. People are getting their information from other places, and we'll cover that now. Anyone recognize the monkey? No one could admit to it? It's the evil monkey from Family Guy. Lives in Chris's closet, I think. So there were regular misconceptions that came up in interviews, and we'll go through some of them. Evolution is just a theory and hasn't been empirically proven is one. And we'll cover that in a minute. Evolution equates to atheism. Certainly not true. That what I call the man-monkey situation, which we will definitely cover in a minute, because I'm going to use a bit of Arabic linguistics just for Sheikh Tajri. I thought I'd make him happy with some Arabic. Interestingly enough, some of my participants actually explained the creation story in the Quran, or they thought it was the Quran. They gave me biblical details. And I think I understand where that comes from. If you, as I did, grow up watching things like The Simpsons and stuff like that, they quite often have a lot of the stories that are based on their understanding of the biblical story of creation. That's where you absorb information from, subconsciously. You don't always understand it. People can articulate where they got these ideas from. But your average sort of, you know, your average, like some of the guys I spoke to, like if you speak to a young Pakistani guy who lives in East London, he's never read the Bible. So where's he got these ideas from? There's something going on in our wider society that's influencing these views. Be tough with me on time, by the way. I'll take liberties like people do with Mustafi. So the idea that it's just a theory. So this is the idea that...
Time's up. This guy.
No one else is an Arsenal fan here, are they? Okay, good. Oh, God, there's always one, isn't there? So this idea that evolution is not scientifically verifiable is quite interesting. I heard this quite regularly. It wasn't just evolution hasn't been empirically proven. It's that it can't be because we can't observe it. Evolutionary biologists would really argue this point. I'm not here to promote one view or another, but that was repeated many times. I mean, misconceptions over the word theory were quite often, you know, we were told it's just a theory. So here, so Basim, we were taught it was Darwin's theory, so I would say it's a theory. Here, Zain, I would say theory. It was always called the evolution theory. You know, the classic comeback to this is it's the theory of gravity, but you don't doubt that it exists just because it's called the theory of gravity, do you? It's that kind of semantic argument. But that was a common reason for people to argue against evolution. Now this is interesting. Again, this is from Amy Unsworth and David Varas's poll. So this question, there is strong, reliable evidence to support the theory of evolution. And this is pretty much split. So you've got 38.1%. A slight majority of people agreed or strongly agreed with that. 31% of people were sort of not sure, and 30% of people said no. Education and evolution. So because I was noticing this difference to do with where people had their high schooling, I wondered if evolution is taught differently amongst those countries. And actually, from people's experiences, it seems to be pretty much the same. I tried to access some of the curriculums as people have written articles about the curriculum in places like Pakistan and Syria, Lebanon, so we can at least make some kind of comparisons. Interestingly enough, Iran seems to be the country that I've encountered most that actually teaches, at least in theory, evolution to the greatest degree. Having spoken to some people that went to school in Iran, they don't seem to back that up, but certainly that's what the curriculum seems to suggest. But I won't go through too much of this, but basically everybody was saying the same thing, regardless of where they went to school. We had a very brief education about evolution. I don't really remember much about it, and the main thing they remembered was the little chimp to the guy with a briefcase, which everybody know that kind of image. It's not particularly helpful if you want to understand what evolution is about. In fact, it's probably one of the most misleading images that there are. I don't have one today. I usually have one that ends up with Darth Vader holding a lightsaber.
Was the image used to publicize?
Yeah, that was one used to. Who chose that? Was it Roxana? Yeah. Okay. That's the classical image of evolution that comes to people's mind, but it's very, very, very misleading, and has done a lot of damage to people understanding it. So this I thought was quite interesting. So this was Yasser, who was of Syrian background. He actually grew up in Syria, went to school in Syria, but he went to a private Christian school in Syria. He was Muslim, but he went to a private Christian school. He said it was taught as it is. We studied it amongst other theories. Well, when we were taught inheritance, genetics. So there was Lamarck theory, where if you were an Iron Man and you develop big arm muscles, you're going to bequeath that to your children. Then Darwin theory, which is different, and Lamarck was taught as an obsolete theory vis-a-vis Darwinism. I went to school in the UK. I never heard the name Lamarck ever be taught. Did anybody hear Lamarck's name be mentioned at school? Heard Darwin, right? But not Lamarck. Okay. Let alone to be able to distinguish between these ideas. But that wasn't a state school in Syria. Okay. So I mentioned this before. I will just quickly touch on this. So are Muslims indoctrinated by their parents, though? No. As I said, Muslims don't discuss this with their families. Very few participants had ever heard evolution discussed in families, Muslim social circles or networks, certainly not discussed in mosques. The only participant I had that had heard evolution discussed in a mosque was an Iraqi participant of mine her local mosque, it's a Shia mosque, actually invited somebody from Harun Yahya to come and talk at the mosque. And she said that she went to the talk as somebody who didn't believe in evolution. She heard a representative from the Harun Yahya movement talk and she left believing in it, which is fascinating. And there's a couple of incidents like that that have been noted elsewhere. So even if Harun Yahya people are being invited to places, they're not winning many adherents, which is really, really interesting. Monkeys and apes, okay. You know, I talked earlier about this linguistic difference between monkeys and apes. What's fascinating is, when I was doing my interviews, after a while, I started to pick up on something. If people explained evolution using the word monkey, chances are they were going to take a negative stance. If they used the word ape, chances are they were going to be positive. And I'm going to use this guy as an example. So this is Omar. He was fascinating because when we discussed, about evolution, if he was talking purely scientifically about the scientific theory of evolution, he used the word ape. Whenever we discussed religion, he switched to the word monkey because he thought that he had to be negative about it. So there's something, some people don't like the word monkey. They don't want to relate to monkeys. I don't know quite why that is. I think in languages there's something interesting that came up. And I don't know how this plays a role. Who speaks Arabic? Who speaks Urdu? Got Arabic speakers, Urdu speakers? Arabic? Yeah, Urdu? Okay. I'm sure technically there must be, I don't know, I'll ask the Arabic teacher in the room. Technically, scientifically speaking, there must be a difference between ape and monkey in Arabic.
Not yet linguistically, no.
Because I know in common usage, what I'm familiar with, that you don't distinguish. So I'm just curious, I don't know the answer to this, this is hypothetical. How would you translate, for instance, Planet of the Apes, sorry. Kawkab al-Qirada. This is the original version, original release. How would you translate that if you were translating that from Arabic to English? Which would you go with? I'm just curious to see how these things have a legacy. And I'm told, I don't speak Urdu, I'm told that Bandar is the same problem. It's monkey and it's ape. I was actually talking to Salman Hamid, who I was talking about earlier, and I presented this, and I using the Arabic. He said, you know what, because he's from Pakistan originally. He said, I'm curious to see what it is in Urdu. And he looked it up. Planet of the Apes, the recent film, was released in Urdu. Apparently it was called 1,000 Monkeys Loose in the City. So I thought it was just really interesting. Bit of a different vibe.
Someone does a subtitling job that day.
Can you do? Okay, so what is influencing people? Unsurprisingly, social media. You know, this whole thing about, you know, if you want to know like extremism, you want to find out about extremism, go to the mosque, find out what's going on. The mosque is not the place where people get their information from, is it? Social media, YouTube, stuff like that, far more important. These are the kind of voices that were influential for a lot of my participants. Very different positions when it comes to evolution. Zakir Naik is very kind of against. Hamza Yusuf, I've heard largely negative, put it that way. Yasser Qadi is more of an interesting figure because he's actually spent time talking about this. He rules out human evolution, but is quite open-minded to other things. Anyone familiar with Adnan Ibrahim? He's got a whole lecture series online about evolution in Islam. It's fascinating, it's been subtitled as well.
And the background has the imagery.
Yeah, it does, yeah. But he goes into the whole Huxley-Tyndall discussions and debates from the 19th century. So he really goes in depth. And he was shown as being influential amongst my participants, but no one said that they actually listened to his lectures specifically on evolution. It was just in general. And people that listened to him didn't always follow his position on evolution. Well, people that listen to Zakir Naik, all of them reject evolution. So it's kind of different ways that they've got influence. And I would just say, you know what I was saying, like popular culture, these are the kind of things that we've been bombarded with since we were younger. I used to watch The Simpsons a lot. This is typical. Ned Flanders goes to a museum and he's worried his kids are going to see this kind of evolutionary image. It presents us with that idea of conflict. South Park, again, was a bit more detailed, but that's kind of crude, so I'm not going to go into it too much. Paul. Anyone see the film Paul? With the alien who just gets high and like sort of wisecracks. That was actually raised by one of my participants. When I said to him about, do you think science and religion are in conflict? He said, yeah. I said, why? He said, it's like the film Paul. If anyone's seen the film Paul, it's like stereotypical science-religion debates. You have this kind of ignorant hillbilly woman who walks around with a T-shirt with Jesus shooting Charles Darwin saying, evolve this. And she's kind of like, oh no, the world's only 10,000 years old. And he's like, oh, stupid, idiot religious people. And he just gives her all his knowledge straight away. We've been bombarded with these images since we were young. And the influence they have is quite real. So I'll just conclude with a few small points. The assumption of the mass Muslim rejection of evolution is not supported by any data that I've seen that's, that I would consider to be reliable. The rejection that does exist is not the result of clashing epistemologies. It's not a science versus religion thing. People are not using religious or scientific debates most of the time to reject it. It's usually just objections to, like, you know, you'll hear things like, I just don't think we came from monkeys, you know. It's certainly not due to indoctrination by kids. So Dawkins, whatever he says, is wrong on both of those counts. And I think that identity is playing a key role. I probably need social psychologists to actually get into the whole identity studies bit, but I think there's definitely something to work on there, and but that's pretty much what I got.